No one cares about Star Wars anymore. It's sad, isn't it? In the mid to late 2010s, the world was stuck in a Star Wars haze. Both fans and casual audiences excited and thrilled for a new era of film's most iconic franchise. Now, Disney has released the trailer for The Mandalorian and Grogu, the first Star Wars movie in almost 7 years, featuring two characters who became pop culture icons just before COVID hit. And no one, not general audiences, not Star Wars fans, seems to care. But I do remember a time, in the early, guiltless and responsibility-free days of my childhood, when, even if general audiences didn't seem to care about Star Wars, we, the fans, did. Let me bring you back to the day it all changed. The date was the 30th of October 2012, and after completing my homework, 9-year-old Louis hopped on the family computer and opened YouTube to discover news that would shock, surprise, and delight my child self. Star Wars was back. George Lucas had sold Star Wars to Disney. Oh, sorry, what was it he called them?
White slavers that take these things and okay, but I mean,
yeah, them, for the eye-watering price of $4 billion. This definitely wasn't a bad deal on Disney's part, as they've more than received a return on that investment by now. The news came with the announcement of a sequel trilogy, an episodes 7, 8, and 9, like my child self had read and fantasized about on countless Star Wars forums across the web. Not only that, but the main man himself, Mr. George Lucas, was returning in a consultancy role and had even written a treatment for the script. It was a good day to be an autistic 9-year-old obsessed with Star Wars, and probably a rather irritating one for my parents, who I incessantly and annoyingly info-dumped on. Did I have any concerns about Disney handling Star Wars? Of course not. I was 9. If I did have any concerns, it would have simply been an aversion to the idea of Mickey Mouse and Goofy having a lightsaber duel aboard the Death Star. Although we still do have Kingdom Hearts for that. Nah, kids just don't care about company acquisitions and business negotiations. I cared about more Star Wars. And I was finally getting that. A chance to experience a new trilogy of Star Wars myself in the cinemas, like my parents could with the prequels and grandparents could with the originals.
Wow, what an ending! Who'd have thought Darth Vader was Luke Skywalker's father?
Thank you, Mr. Blow the Picture for me.
But then they took my Clone Wars.
Because of these new exciting changes and things happening, other things have to wind down and come to a close, and that's what we're going to be doing with Star Wars: The Clone Wars. And I know a lot of you have written letters and emailed and would love the show to persist.
Now, being a Star Wars fan in the early 2010s was actually quite a chill time, if I'm being honest. A lot of the ire of the prequels had died down, and we were getting new and interesting novels, comics, and video games coming steadily and consistently. No blockbuster films or live-action TV shows. The biggest thing coming out of Star Wars at the time was Star Wars: The Clone Wars. Don't get me wrong, The Clone Wars got off to a rough start. The film was god-awful, the first couple seasons were rough around the edges, but at the time Disney bought Star Wars, The Clone Wars was hitting its stride. With a return of characters like Darth Maul, in-depth looks at the complexity of the clones, and it was even strengthening some of the arcs and plot points of the prequels. As I've gotten older, I have begun to recognize some of the flaws, but the fact remains that my child self loved it, and to this day I believe some of the best Star Wars can be found in the Clone Wars. On the 11th of March 2013, just days after The Clone Wars had aired the final episode of its 5th season, a dramatic, show-stopping moment. Do you see what I did there? In which Ahsoka Tano, essentially the protagonist of the show, leaves the Jedi Order, leaving fans on the edge of their seat to discover the fate of her, Darth Maul, and iconic clones such as Fives and Rex. For many of these characters, the answers to their fate would not be revealed for years, and none of them would be quite in the medium we would expect. They announced that a shortened Season 6 would be released in 2014, which, in typical Clone Wars fashion, featured some of the show's best and worst episodes. Eventually, after much fan outcry, they did release a Season 7 in 2020, which had an additional 3 of the show's planned arcs, including Siege of Mandalore, the original Season 8 finale of the show. And like Season 6, this new Season 7 featured some of the best and worst arcs of the show's run. But I'm getting ahead of myself. We're still in 2013. My point is, even with the additional 25 episodes released after Disney originally cancelled the show, there's still around 40 that have never seen the light of day ever since the Clone Wars got clamped under Disney's boot. There was going to be an arc about Boba Fett and Cad Bane, which is bizarrely referenced in the Book of Boba Fett show, despite the fact that the arc has never been seen by even the most devout Star Wars fan.
I've known you a long time, Bobo.
Don't toy with me. I'm not a little boy any longer.
There was going to be an arc about Darth Maul and Mother Talzin teaming up with Count Dooku to fight Darth Sidious and General Grievous, which did end up getting adapted into a comic book, but which the Season 7 arc Siege of Mandalore assumes you have knowledge of. Another pair of arcs would have focused on Quinlan Vos and Asajj Ventress' romantic relationship as the pair teamed up to assassinate Count Dooku, which did become a novel. However, this would have been one of the only chances to see Quinlan do anything interesting at all in canon. Those are just the big ones. There was an R2-D2 Rex Top Gun style arc, an arc where Ahsoka would discover a Sith temple buried beneath the Jedi temple and also encounter Darth Sidious, an arc with Yoda and the Wookiees, a second Mon Cala arc, even one which would tackle the Yuuzhan Vong. I haven't even listed all of them. We will probably never see these stories. So yes, very early into Disney's ownership of Star Wars, they had pissed off a 9-year-old, which is monumental work on their part, I must say. I wasn't the only one. Hashtags of Save the Clone Wars flooded the internet, which fell on deaf ears until several years later when Disney finally released Season 7. But as I mentioned, this was just 12 of the almost 60 episodes they'd cancelled. I grieved the Clone Wars, and in some ways I still do. It was a highlight of my childhood and the focus of many formative memories. And in some ways, it's easy to correlate the onset of my adolescence, where everything started to get a lot worse, with the cancellation of this show, which happened at a very similar time. But fine. A few angrily worded YouTube comments, and I was ready to move on from the Clone Wars. Dave Filoni and his team were working on a new animated series, and I still had those 13 episodes that were coming out in 2014 to look forward to. If a cancellation of the Clone Wars was the price to be paid for a new sequel trilogy and a resurgence of Star Wars not just across nerd culture, but across all culture, then fine. It didn't take long to piss off the fans again. On the 25th of April 2014, Disney decanonized a huge array of Star Wars content. The only things that remained canon under their new leadership were the original 6 films and the Clone Wars TV series. Everything else, from comics to novels to video games to the older animated series, even the reference books, all of them were now deemed legends in order to make a cleaner slate for Disney to build their new Star Wars universe. This understandably irritated a lot of us. Yes, it did make sense to at least decanonize large chunks of the post-Return of the Jedi material, since it would have been near impossible to build a compelling sequel trilogy while writing around those stories, but they didn't even do that anyway, so what did it matter? Besides, pre-Disney, it was long established that whatever may be canon can be overwritten by the films and even the Clone Wars TV show. In fact, lore about the Clone Wars was very different before George Lucas made the prequels, so the total abolishment of every single piece of canon was nothing short of overkill. Because of this choice, some of the best stories in Star Wars are now considered legends, be it the Heir to the Empire trilogy, the Darth Bane trilogy, or the Old Republic. These were all dropped and abandoned by Disney. In the case of the first, this was given a cheap Disney Plus replacement, and in the case of the latter two, they're barely, if at all, contradicted in the Disney canon, which begs the question, why abandon these in the first place? The only piece of Legends material that still receives content is the Old Republic MMO, which is itself dying. Now, don't get me wrong, there was some really fucking dumb stuff in Legends as well. Palpatine clones, which Disney actually somehow thought was a good idea and made their own version in canon. More on that later. Luke Skywalker was a whole thing, and the Yuzang Vong, while cool as a concept, are a bit silly and don't necessarily go well with the vibes of how I see Star Wars. But, in my opinion, the good definitely outweighed the bad, and it's less the decanonization that annoyed me, and more the fact that all these Legends characters, and even time periods, were promptly abandoned to make a bunch of Disney Plus series about the same 15 characters in one 50-year time frame. But whatever, fine. Disney wanted a fresh start, and Star Wars canon was becoming increasingly hard to follow after almost 40 years of various novels, comics, and video games, so it's not like there were no benefits. And besides, this made me a bona fide expert in Star Wars canon at just 11 years old. I already knew those films and the Clone Wars like the back of my hand, and very few, if anyone, in the world could say they knew everything about what we now refer to as Star Wars Legends. This could be a clean slate to learn everything there was to know about my favourite fictional universe, and for Disney to make a new canon, bigger, bolder, better, and more consistent than ever before. The naivete of youth. Next, I turned my attention to the first major release in Disney Star Wars' pipeline. That would be Star Wars Rebels, Dave Filoni's new animated show set between Episode 3 and 4, and the spiritual successor to Star Wars The Clone Wars. My first thought was definitely one of disappointment. The animation style was flatter, less detailed, and cheaper than The Clone Wars, and where The Clone Wars was maturing as I was, Rebels, especially in the early seasons, went right back to that cartoonish, child-friendly style, even more so than the early seasons of The Clone Wars. I caught a couple episodes, and over the years I continued to check on the show periodically. I wasn't an avid watcher of it the same way I was of The Clone Wars. It certainly improved and acted as a vehicle to continue the stories of several Clone Wars characters, including Ahsoka, Rex, and Maul, and some of the new characters such as Kanan and Hera became compelling in their own right. It also introduced Thrawn to canon, and while I don't find him as interesting in canon as I do in the Heir to the Empire trilogy, this wasn't a bad take on Thrawn at all, and it gets the vibes of his character right, if not the quality of his old stories. All this to say, Rebels actually turned out to be fairly alright, and probably in the better half of the Disney-produced Star Wars media. Despite that though, I still think it was a major step down from the Clone Wars, and while the lows don't stoop as low as the Clone Wars ever did, it never quite reaches the highs of the Clone Wars either, and the times it does come closest to doing so is when it's wrapping up the story arcs and conclusions of some key Clone Wars characters. I bring this up to highlight the funny irony of it all. Something that I would look back on years later as being one of the better things produced under Disney's reign of Star Wars was something I was initially really disappointed with as an 11-year-old who was obsessed with the Clone Wars. I'm aware that this is a subjective opinion, some people prefer Rebels over the Clone Wars, and that's fine. But personally, I was disappointed. Let's be honest though, we weren't excited about the sale of Star Wars to Disney because they might make a spiritual successor animated show to the Clone Wars, inferior or not. No, the main draw of the sale for both fans and investors alike was the sequel trilogy. The chance to see Luke Skywalker, Leia Organa, and Han Solo on screen again for the first time in over 30 years. It was a dream that had quietly slept in the minds of all nerddom since the 80s. And towards the tail end of 2014, we got our first trailer for Star Wars Episode 7, The Force Awakens. Now, despite some initial confusion over the actual practicality of a crossguard lightsaber, and questions as to who all these new characters are, and why stormtroopers and TIE fighters were back, the reaction was one of pure excitement from, well, everyone. It did seem like George Lucas was no longer involved, but to a lot of fans in 2014, that was almost a good thing, seeing as his total creative control was the thing that ruined the prequels in so many ways. I mentioned before that until 2012, general audiences had stopped caring about Star Wars, but Star Wars fans themselves still did. Well, this trailer was probably when the general public got back on the Star Wars hype train. The return of Star Wars had transformed from a news article they saw back in 2012 to an unavoidable cultural phenomenon. For a year, Star Wars was everywhere. Nerds and non-nerds alike would go into school or work and would discuss the latest piece of marketing material for Star Wars The Force Awakens. People were happy for a return to classic Star Wars, with X-Wings and desert planets, and embraced for more practical effects compared to the poorly aged CGI light show that was for prequels. In fact, the most commonly phrased sentiment was, "It can't be worse than the prequels." This new wave of prequel love that happened when my generation found their voice online didn't exist yet, and honestly, the view that it can't be worse than the prequels wasn't some pie-in-the-sky optimism, but more a practical, measured view of the situation. The prequels in 2015 were universally hated on and trashed online.
Star Wars The Phantom Menace was the most disappointing thing since my son.
And the originals were nostalgic cult classics.
She's never seen Star Wars? Ted, the only people in the universe who haven't seen Star Wars are the characters in Star Wars, and that's because they lived them, Ted. That's because they lived the Star Wars.
The view that the sequel trilogy would sit somewhere in the middle quality-wise was nothing short of pragmatic. We got another trailer, and then another, each establishing more and more interesting ideas. Was our protagonist a defected stormtrooper? Did our villain seem to worship Darth Vader? Perhaps most importantly of all, where was Luke Skywalker? The protagonist of the original trilogy and the biggest box office draw of the film was conspicuously absent from all the marketing material. By the night of the film's release on the 18th of December 2015, the excitement for this film was a powder keg waiting to explode. I was 12 years old, and my family had moved into our new property that same day, when I had to inform my stepdad at the time, also a lifelong Star Wars fan, that no, you can't sleep after a full day of moving. We'll have tickets for the new Star Wars movie, remember? The man was so tired, he actually fell asleep inside the IMAX cinema of a movie he was genuinely anticipating. He woke up to Han Solo dying, which I'm sure was a shock.
Tonight is the night, and this is the hour. Right now at 7, the very first showing of Star Wars The Force Awakens begins at theaters all across the country. How excited are you for tonight?
At 1 out of 10, I'm a 10. 10 being the highest. Like, this is insane. I dressed up as the new villain, Kylo Ren, just because I know he's probably going to be iconic from here on out.
Yeah, I've been saving up my hype for 2 years since Disney announced they're making more movies, so that'll be pretty fun. I've been looking forward to this forever.
Tonight's Star Wars The Force Awakens is expected to shatter box office records, and some experts say it could be the first film to break the $3 billion mark.
This was my first midnight release for any film, and we only went to the local cinema in a not massively populated area. The lobby was full. From wall to wall, there were Wookiees, people wearing Jedi robes and swinging lightsabers, stormtrooper helmets adorning every second head. I felt out of place, wearing nothing but a t-shirt with Darth Vader on it. I was in Nirvana, in a room full of fellow nerds, allowed to stay up past midnight and have the next day off school, all to see those iconic words, "A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away," come quietly onto the screen. Witness the yellow logos come blaring into my retinas while John Williams' fanfare made sweet love to my ears. In all the years of Disney owning Star Wars, this was the singular best moment of their ownership and one of the best cinema experiences of all time for me, right up there with the portal scene in Endgame. It was one of those spine-chilling, awe-inspiring moments that reminds us all of our love for cinema, and short of dementia, I can't see it being a moment I will ever forget, and every Star Wars fan in the world can relate to that sentiment. Well, maybe not these guys.
Fucking moron.
But what was the movie itself like? Well, at the time I thought it was pretty good. Decent. The parallels to A New Hope were plain to see even at 12 years old, but A New Hope was a solid blueprint. By the way, it's Star Wars, not A New Hope, but I'll refer to it as A New Hope for the sake of clarity. In retrospect, I think The Force Awakens hamstrung the entire sequel trilogy by being so derivative of the originals, essentially resetting the work done by the characters in the originals and returning the galaxy to fascism with no clear explanation as to how or why this happened. And there still isn't really, to this day. Once again, the heroes are the scrappy underdogs and the villains are the big bad fascists. It didn't really leave 8 and 9 many places to go after 7's initial criticisms. You could either subvert these rehashed ideas in controversial ways, or you could retread the same plot beats in a new corporate sheen without the additive of nostalgia. Despite that though, in a void, Episode 7 was alright, and the general audiences and Star Wars fans both reacted positively to it. There was some concerns with Rey being a Mary Sue, but this criticism, along with the criticism that it was too similar to A New Hope, were the movie's major sins, and considering the prequels had also committed many mistakes, many audiences were willing to look past them, no doubt enticed by the literal cliffhanger of Luke Skywalker's reveal. At release, they bagged themselves a $2.068 billion box office, making it the third highest grossing film of all time when it released. It is currently the 6th. And it remains the highest grossing Star Wars film to this day. The Force Awakens was no Empire Strikes Back, but the fact remained that Disney's first cinematic release with the Star Wars IP had been a resounding success, both critically and commercially, enough to propel the franchise forward at any rate. At the time though, I felt there was something missing, something which I now realise was world building. I think even at 12 I knew I was missing some world building to some degree, but not having been around for the release of the previous 2 trilogies, I assumed that the world building built up over the years after the films had been released. This isn't true. In fact, both the prequels and the originals had extensive world building, both in the films themselves and in the expanded universe material that released either with or shortly after the film. The era of the sequels felt so flat, like no world existed beyond the 2-hour film we watched. And that stopped me from holding The Force Awakens in anywhere near the same reverence as the originals or even the prequels, despite The Force Awakens being better than the first 2 prequels on a number of technical levels. After all, I loved the world of Star Wars more than any of the individual films, and the world in the sequels barely seemed to exist. Okay, Episode 7 was a mixed bag, but the fan sentiment and spirit of love for the franchise was still the same. Disney wasn't just doing a sequel trilogy after all. In between the entries of the sequel trilogy, they were also planning spin-offs. The first of these would be Rogue One, a spin-off which would follow the tale of the daring rebels who captured the first Death Star plans, mentioned in the first paragraph of the opening crawl of A New Hope. Now, the excitement for Rogue One was nowhere near The Force Awakens levels. That's simply by nature of it no longer being the first Star Wars film in a decade, and of it being a tighter, smaller story without the big draw of legacy characters beyond a cameo from Vader and CGI Grand Moff Tarkin. Despite that, audiences were massively drawn to this war drama set in the Star Wars universe where every character died at the end. It was a good proof of concept that interesting and unique stories could be told in this universe, and they didn't require loads of lightsabers and Jedi and Sith. Rogue One bagged itself a respectable $1.057 billion at the box office and was a major critical success. Without a doubt, Rogue One is the best Star Wars movie made under Disney. At the time though, I didn't like it. Why? Because I was 13 years old, a dumb kid, and I wanted lightsabers and Jedi and Luke Skywalker. And Andor hadn't released yet. I still think Rogue One is a great movie on its own, much better than I thought it was 9 years ago, but Andor did a lot to make Rogue One retroactively better by making the characters more compelling. Looking back, it's an important reminder that not all Star Wars needs to be for everyone, and my taste now as a 22-year-old man are very different to that of a 13-year-old teenager. All that truly matters is that the quality is there for those who are looking for that sort of thing, and Rogue One had that in spades. Rogue One certainly didn't contribute to Star Wars' dwindling popularity beyond being the first of the spin-offs that we'd soon be saturated with. In fact, it reinforced Disney from some of the criticism that Episode 7 had faced. It was demonstrable proof that Disney could make some good Star Wars. Do not be fooled. Judgment Day was soon approaching for Star Wars. That period of 2015 to 2017 was the height of Star Wars culture in my life. Almost everyone was invested in this franchise in some way, shape, or form, and almost everyone had a genuinely positive relationship with Star Wars. Sure, this new era wasn't perfect, but Star Wars never had been, and at the time we were getting more Star Wars content than ever before. However, on the 15th of December 2017, that all changed with the release of Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. I don't think there's much I could possibly say about The Last Jedi, which hasn't been said 1,000 times in 1,000 video essays across this platform. Everyone with a camera, a microphone, and an internet connection seems to have something to say about this fucking film. And I'll say something which will probably get me hate from both sides of the aisle. I don't like The Last Jedi, but I really respect it. I did not like their treatment of Luke Skywalker as a character. It wasn't the Luke I remembered or loved, and it was a waste, in my opinion, to have Luke spend the majority of his return to the big screen being the antithesis of his pre-established character. I did not enjoy the Canto Bight storyline, or the character of Rose Tycho. I thought the decision to have both the three legacy protagonists and the three new protagonists barely interact with each other over the course of the film to be an intensely strange one. We never get that scene of Luke, Han, and Leia I'm sure we were all imagining when the sequels were announced. Although, to be fair, that is more the Force Awakens' fault. But likewise, Rey and Poe's first interaction on screen is at the very end of The Last Jedi. Imagine if Han and Luke never interacted until the end of Empire, or Obi-Wan and Padme never spoke until the end of Attack of the Clones. Moreover, I thought the decision to kill Snoke to subvert expectations was a poor one, which possibly hamstrung Episode 9 even more than Episode 7 had hamstrung this film. But, on the other hand, The Last Jedi is actually a bold film by a daring filmmaker with a vision, who wanted to do something slightly controversial with a huge blockbuster franchise, and ended up creating a visually stunning film if nothing else. Yes, the Lightspeed Ram made very little sense in the context of the franchise, but damn if it isn't one of the most beautiful scenes in it. I actually like the decision to make Rey a nobody with no special Skywalker or Palpatine lineage. It's rather profound thematically, and gets immediately pissed on by the Rise of Skywalker. It was this dichotomy, a beautiful, bold film with an unsatisfactory and controversial story that split the Star Wars fanbase down the middle, and the franchise, and honestly arguably blockbuster filmmaking as a whole, has never recovered from this. It made Disney and the other major studios terrified to do new, bold, and different things with their big franchises in case fans react like they did with The Last Jedi.
This movie took everything that you like about Star Wars, that you love about Star Wars, that you thought you knew about Star Wars, and it on it, and it on it again, and then it sets it on fire, and then it on it again.
I don't even have one good fucking thing to say about this movie. It is just rancid diarrhea.
It just fills me up with so much rage inside of my body that it starts lighting my brain cells on fire.
Oh, man, I get so fucking mad talking about this because this movie is so fucking terrible.
I'm pissed off! You know, and I don't get pissed off about movies very often.
What a fucking bomb. What a disappointment. Couldn't believe my fucking eyes.
This movie was complete fucking garbage.
This movie is trash, bruh. This is a whack, trash, garbage movie, and I can't believe what Disney did to me. JJ built some characters up. He built Poe, he built Rey, and he built Finn and Kylo. And guess what they did?
As a result, in recent years, we've got nothing but boring, bland, cookie cutter, and soulless garbage, with the only exceptions to that rule being the time Disney probably wasn't paying too much attention to the production anyway. The film had earned a solid $1.332 billion at the box office, but at what cost? The peaceful fandom of 2015 to 2017, excitedly theorizing about the identity of Snoke and Rey's parents, was gone. Instead, we now had a toxic fandom war, with some fans calling The Last Jedi the best film in the franchise, and others acting like it was a disgrace to cinema. The culture war warriors started to come out in full force around this time. No, it wasn't enough to criticize the new Star Wars films on their many flaws. No, they were woke now. Or actually, what we called it back then was SJW. Because of course, the franchise about a small group of plucky and diverse rebels overthrowing a uniform fascist regime was never woke before, right? The film turned Star Wars from an exciting resurgence to the most toxic fandom on the internet, and it has spent the recent years in a state of rapid decline. Not to worry though, because Disney had the cure to what ails us, in the form of Solo, a Star Wars story. I mean, honestly, I could probably just end this video here, because around this time, a lot of people stopped caring about Star Wars. It wasn't quite at the disastrous levels that we now have today. Baby Yoda memes and Andor Reddit still awaited in the franchise's future, but yet no one cared about Solo, a Star Wars story, including myself. It was actually the first Star Wars film I didn't go see in the cinema. Why? Because I was 15, I didn't have a great deal of money, and I'd already recently visited the cinema to see Avengers Infinity War, which released a few weeks prior, and 99% of the world, including me, a lifelong Star Wars over Marvel fan, was a lot more excited for. Infinity War is also a Disney property, so the decision to place a spin-off film for their struggling new acquisition so close to their box office juggernaut almost feels like a deliberate act of self-sabotage on their part. But it would be unfair to blame Solo doing awfully at the box office purely on Avengers Infinity War. Because yes, this film made a measly $393 million at the box office, becoming the first Star Wars film to lose money, and also single-handedly banished Star Wars as a franchise from cinemas for almost a decade due to its commercial failings. Which I find stupid, because apparently the MCU can have like 5 of them and still manage to keep chugging along. But regardless, why did Solo do so bad? Well, I've already mentioned Infinity War, but there was also the fact that this film was plagued with production issues from the very start. It only had 5 months between The Last Jedi and this film's release, which may work for Marvel, but works less well for Star Wars, which historically has been a cinematic event in movie theaters. Not only that, but The Last Jedi had left a bad taste in people's mouths. The fandom was and still is divided, and no one really wanted more Star Wars just then. People were just sick to death of the ongoing discourse. Besides that, they barely marketed the film, and it was a Han Solo film without Harrison Ford that was utterly boring and mediocre. So much so that the film isn't actually bad or good enough for me to want to talk about the content of the film itself. No, Solo is much more interesting as a case study. The numbers alone tell the story of just where the Star Wars franchise was at the time, just 2.5 years after the explosive hype of The Force Awakens. One might think that after 2 major failures, Disney might take a step back, reevaluate this franchise, and ultimately try and fix it. No, my friend. Instead, they locked themselves in a boardroom with what I can only imagine was some terrible precursor to ChatGPT, desperately using algorithms to try and make a Star Wars film least likely to piss the whole world off. And on the 20th of December 2019, they shat out the most corporate, cookie-cutter, generic affront to both Star Wars as a whole and blockbuster filmmaking in general. I am, of course, talking about Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
In a fucking Fortnite event. My hatred for this film is something that cannot be described in any number of human words. You see, each and every single one of the other Star Wars films besides this one has something that I can respect in it. A glimmer of hope and quality, or maybe even outright good. Not The Rise of Skywalker. The biggest thing that ruined the sequels was the lack of an overall plan. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't believe George Lucas had every single detail of the originals mapped out, or Luke and Leia would have never ended up kissing, but still, the originals were tied together under his vision. The prequels I actually think were mapped out fairly intricately from their inception despite their flaws. The sequels, not so much. There was no collaboration or planning involved, with each director's film their own purview. As a result, the sequels go from the vision of J.J. Abrams with Episode 7, to the vision of Rian Johnson for Episode 8, right back to J.J. Abrams for Episode 9. As a result, in a disastrous attempt at course correction, Episode 9 undoes nearly every single decision made by Episode 8. Rey and nobody? Psych, she's actually a Palpatine. Didn't like how you got no answers about Snoke? Well, he has a bunch of Snokes in a jar, and he's actually a failed Palpatine clone controlled by him. Didn't like Luke's character? That's okay, we'll give him a cheesy one-liner to address the discourse.
A Jedi's weapon deserves more respect.
I have never seen a more limp-dicked, cowardly film in all my life. And also, it's just so fucking boring, man. As a huge Star Wars fan, I desperately hope that my family's life never depends on me remembering a single name of one of the characters introduced in this film, because if so, my family will be very fucking dead. It's flat, uninteresting and dull, and retroactively ruins the arcs of one of the few characters not ruined by the sequels, Anakin Skywalker, by having Palpatine return, and making his sacrifice meaningless.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
I've only seen this film once, in the cinemas, and I have zero desire to ever watch it again, no matter how much I might love Star Wars. It is a genuinely terrible piece of filmmaking. Honestly, the discourse on this film wasn't nearly as awful as The Last Jedi. I don't know if it's because people just stopped caring as much by then and had already written it off, or if it's because Disney's efforts to pander to the lowest common denominator actually worked on that vocal outset of people. With that said, the film made $1.077 billion, much better than Solo, but the worst of the sequels, and honestly piss poor for what was meant to be the conclusion to one of the biggest franchises in the world, just months after Endgame had made almost $3 billion. I don't want to talk about this film any more than I have to, and neither does the internet, because there's still far more video essays debating The Last Jedi than this. I put that down to The Last Jedi's quality genuinely being controversial, whereas everyone more or less universally agrees that The Rise of Skywalker was a steaming pile of dog shit, so what is there to even say? I had at least left The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi with a honeymoon phase of really liking the film for several weeks. The Rise of Skywalker seemed shit to my 16-year-old self the moment I walked out the cinema. Was this just my maturity, or my disillusionment, or was the film just genuinely that fucking bad? All of the above? Suffice it to say, I had come a long way from that bright-eyed 9-year-old excitedly checking YouTube that fateful 2012 evening. I was 16 now, and I was just about done with Star Wars, and it seemed like Star Wars was done with me. I no longer recognized the franchise that I'd grown up with, and even from a larger macro standpoint, I thought Star Wars was done now, cooked, finished, finito. And it probably would have been too, if not for that green little fuck Baby Yoda. The first season of The Mandalorian released on Disney Plus a couple of weeks before The Rise of Skywalker came out, actually. I mention it now purely for structural reasons, and thank God it did release when it did, because if we didn't at least have the palatable 8 out of 10 that was Season 1 of The Mandalorian before COVID kicked off, Star Wars truly would have been cooked. The Mandalorian was pretty good. Slightly overrated in retrospect, but perhaps that was just in contrast to the shit show that was Star Wars cinema at the time. But yeah, The Mandalorian initially started off as a fun, standalone show telling unique, isolated stories about two characters that had nothing to do with the Skywalker saga. It was no Better Call Saul or Game of Thrones, but it was a fun, enjoyable watch that most people seemed to like, and it was disconnected enough from the larger franchise that I still allowed some small modicum of hope that we could still get high quality spin-off material from Star Wars. But really, The Mandalorian being a decent show isn't what saved Star Wars. That would be the Baby Yoda memes, because this was back before Grogu had a name, and they were everywhere. The basic girl in your class was sharing Baby Yoda memes. Your teacher was putting them in PowerPoints. Your grandma would text them to you. Everyone, even people who'd never seen a Star Wars movie or show in their life, was all over this Baby Yoda shit. And at the 11th hour, possibly combined with everyone being locked inside for COVID, the franchise was saved. Not on its own merits, but by the power of meme culture. It was around this time that we got that extra season of the Clone Wars that I mentioned at the start of the video. It had one mediocre arc, one terrible arc, and one truly amazing arc which stands as some of the best Star Wars content ever made. Perhaps it was this too which kept me coming back to Star Wars like an abused housewife. The small glimmers of hope. My childhood show returning with one of the best arcs they've ever made? Peak. Absolute peak. But Star Wars is nothing if not inconsistent, and it wouldn't be long before I'd be disappointed again. But Disney started to realize something. Since their purchasing of Star Wars, the prequel era was pretty much abandoned by Disney due to its negative perception, and events from the prequels were barely mentioned, let alone seen. But two things happened to change this prequel hate. One, the generation that grew up with those films began to find their voices online and would defend those films to the bone. And two, Disney had made something genuinely worse than the prequels with the sequel trilogy, so that it can't be worse than the prequels attitude had disappeared, replaced with the attitude of it can't be worse than the sequels. As a result, people started to sing the praises of the prequels in order to make the sequels seem worse by comparison. Now look, in my opinion, the sequels existing doesn't make the prequels good movies all of a sudden. It can be true that the prequels are bad movies and that the sequels are simply a lot worse. However, growing up with the prequels, I did love that particular era of Star Wars in spite of the films, and it was around this time Disney started to cater to prequel nostalgia as well as their original trilogy nostalgia. The sequel trilogy era was what was truly abandoned, with no shows or films as of yet within a 15-year radius of the sequels on the timeline. Then we got The Mandalorian Season 2. The Mandalorian Season 2 is a bit like cocaine. You get a big rush of excitement in the moment, but afterwards you're left feeling empty and wondering what was the point and why you wasted so much money. Yes, in the moment it's cool to have Bo-Katan, Ahsoka Tano, Boba Fett and Luke Skywalker appear every second episode, but you're left wondering what happened to the grounded, focused story about these two characters, and the universe begins to feel vastly small when the same 12 characters pop up all over the place, something that would come to be the signature of Dave Filoni, who was now heading up much of Disney Plus Star Wars. Regardless, even though the Adventure of a Week formula and incessant cameos were becoming tiresome, The Mandalorian Season 2 was still solid and enjoyable, with some genuinely compelling and well-acted moments. It had nowhere near the pitfalls that much of Disney Plus Star Wars would soon come to face. I say Disney Plus Star Wars because, truly, that is all it was now, unless we're talking about the equal mishandling of Star Wars video games, which could be a video essay in and of itself. Or Disney wouldn't want you to think so. They offered a trilogy to the creators of Game of Thrones, then cancelled it after they ruined Game of Thrones to rush to the job. Patty Jenkins was supposedly doing a Rogue Squadron film to release in 2023 that never saw the light of day. Rian Johnson, the director of The Last Jedi, was given a trilogy that seems to be in development hell. There's meant to be a Rey sequel film, a Dawn of a Jedi film. None of these projects have successfully been made, but a new one seems to be announced every other week to reassure audiences that Star Wars cinema wasn't dead. Clearly it was, though, because they've only managed to complete production on one yet-to-be-released film in the 7 years since the Rise of Skywalker, and as I mentioned, no one seems to care. But I will get to that soon. Back to Disney Plus, we got The Bad Batch, which I would consider a decent show, somewhere between Rebels and The Clone Wars in quality level. This was passable, but a passable animated show just wasn't enough to cut it. It was only a matter of time before Disney Plus truly shit the bed. And they did, in late 2021, in the form of The Book of Boba Fett. They somehow decided to make a boring, flat-looking TV show about Boba Fett being a crime lord in which he is opposed to committing any crime. He barely has any screen time, which is thankful, because every time he does, he loses the aura he had in the original trilogy bit by bit. 2 of the episodes are given completely to The Mandalorian, making this terrible show required viewing for anyone watching The Mandalorian Season 3. Not only that, they use the opportunity to reset the ending of Season 2, because God forbid we ever see The Mandalorian without Grogu by his side. It references Clone Wars episodes that were never made, and is overall dull, boring, flat, and lifeless. The epitome of boardroom corporate television. Then they tried to cash in on the prequel era nostalgia by making the Obi-Wan Kenobi show. I was, admittedly, as someone who grew up with the prequels, very excited for this, even though it was a major retcon in the relationship between Kenobi and Vader. But still, it was such a promising premise for a TV show that I could honestly look past that. Imagine my surprise when half the show is focused on a brand new original Inquisitor and a 10-year-old Princess Leia. There's the glimmer of some compelling moments in the finale when we finally get to watch what we came to see, but that's handicapped by the same terrible choreography that plagued the sequels. Overall, while definitely better than the Book of Boba Fett and the Rise of Skywalker, the Kenobi show was ultimately more disappointing. We've reached yet another point where I was done with Star Wars. The next show on the docket was some show about Cassian Andor, and honestly, who in the world had asked for that? The TV shows about Obi-Wan Kenobi and Boba Fett had ranged from absolutely terrible to insanely disappointing, so I wasn't about to get excited about that one guy from Rogue One getting his own TV show. So, I gave up. I decided, for the first time in my life, that I wasn't going to watch the next Star Wars thing. But then Andor actually released, and I began hearing on the grapevine that this new show was actually really fucking good.
Oh my God! Okay, it's happening. Everybody stay calm. What's the procedure, everyone? What's the procedure? Stay calm! Wait! Everybody calm down!
I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and curiosity got the better of me, so I began to watch, and watch, and watch. And the more I watched, a crystalline truth presented itself to me. I was watching the best Star Wars content produced since 1980. You see, I hadn't really been paying attention to Andor before its release, and truthfully, I don't think Disney was either. They were focusing more on the Obi-Wan Kenobi show, whilst Tony Gilroy was secretly cooking in the back room. If Disney had put any measurable focus on it, it probably wouldn't have been anywhere near as good. Tony Gilroy produced a Star Wars show that wasn't just a good Star Wars show like The Mandalorian, but a good show in its own right, standing up there with the greats like Breaking Bad, Game of Thrones, and Succession. He had created a masterful cast of complex and interesting characters and allowed us to get in on the ground level of the Star Wars universe and allow us to see the Empire not just as mustache-swirling villains, but as the authoritarian fascist regime they truly are, making Star Wars more relevant than it has ever been. The writing is Shakespearean, with characters getting amazing soliloquies which are among the best writing not just in Star Wars, but in television as a whole. All this while being by far the best shot, most beautiful piece of Star Wars media. I fell in love with Andor, but more importantly, I fell in love with Star Wars again, and remembered why I love and cherish this franchise so dearly. Not because of its lightsabers and explosions, but through its ability to share human stories about the struggle of good versus evil, told through the rich tapestry of a galaxy far, far away. So I was strapped in for the next bit of Star Wars. Next up was The Mandalorian Season 3, and all my hopes for the future of Star Wars began to sizzle away as I was treated to the worst season of The Mandalorian. It does nothing crucially terrible, besides being dependent on an even worse season of another show to view. It was painfully mediocre though, bordering on fanfiction-y at times with the Gideon Force-sensitive Mandalorian clones, and a brutal reality check after the highs of Andor. So what about the Ahsoka show? I liked Ahsoka as a character, but for some reason, Ahsoka loses pretty much every interesting aspect of her character and becomes some wise stoic sage under the guise of character development. Like The Mandalorian Season 2, the high of the Anakin cameo feels great in the moment, but ultimately feels like empty, cheap fan service. Thrawn's live-action debut is disappointing, and the show heavily relies on you having an intricate knowledge of Star Wars Rebels, all while being another dull, lifeless show shot on the volume. Andor, it would seem, was a lone, solitary blip. I would love to tell you what I thought of The Acolyte and Skeleton Crew, dear watcher, especially as you've made it this far into a very long video, but I must admit these pieces of media are the first Star Wars content in my life that I haven't watched, and I have no desire to. Historically, even though the fans are always the first to be pissed off, general audiences are the first and only ones to leave. But now it looked like the fans were tuning out too. I did watch the first 2 episodes of The Acolyte, excited to finally see a new era of Star Wars, but I wasn't immediately compelled, and the fanbase instantly devolved into chaos over it, and it became hard to detach the genuine criticism from the culture war warriors. I encourage you to watch it on your own if you feel so inclined. I just don't care anymore, I just don't. Skeleton Crew I heard was slightly better, and truth be told I may watch it someday, but still nowhere near the heights of Andor, so I wasn't interested. Disney had killed all interest in Star Wars for me, someone who had been
in this fight since I was 6 years old.
I can only imagine the total apathy the general audience is feeling right now. Luckily, a few months ago, I was treated to the second season of Andor, which outstripped even the first season and is one of my favourite seasons of television of all time. But Andor is over now, and I can't help but feel it was the last hurrah of the Star Wars I love. As amazing as it was, not enough people watched Andor, and that is more down to the failings of its sister shows than anything else. But a lot of those who watched it seemed to agree that this was an end for Star Wars, and when the final episodes were coming out, there was a common sentiment that we better enjoy it while we can, because it's the last good Star Wars we're ever going to get. Which brings us to today. The Mandalorian and Grogu trailer released a few weeks ago, and no one seems to care. No one is talking about it online. The trailer has barely any views, and even Star Wars communities on Reddit and X have expressed a lack of interest in this new film. The first Star Wars film in 7 years, featuring 2 characters that were unavoidable during the universal shared experience of COVID lockdowns. I'd love to look back on this video in a few years and reflect on just how wrong I was. But Star Wars is done. It feels like the inevitable future for Star Wars is a string of box office failures, followed by the winding down of Disney Plus content, and then finally its total disappearance from the live action space. Right back to where we started in 2012, and maybe that's for the best. But what a waste these past years have been. If properly handled, Star Wars today could have been more popular than the MCU at its peak, but it hasn't. A string of poor decision making, filmmaking by committee, and outright capitalist greed has ruined this franchise, which once meant so much to so many people, and ground it into the dirt and possibly permanently damaged the state of the brand. From a once-in-a-lifetime cinematic event to that awful franchise that keeps bringing out bad Disney Plus shows. But it's not all doom and gloom. Andor has shown that Star Wars can still be profound, beautiful, compelling, and meaningful, even in 2025. And to the sad and utter dismay of that 9-year-old on that October 2012 evening, I will no longer consume everything that my beloved franchise produces anymore. I'm an adult now, with responsibilities, and my time is better spent watching media that I actually enjoy. But whilst general audiences and large portions of the fan base don't care anymore, and as much as I still say I don't, I do still care deeply about this franchise that helped raise me and teach me right from wrong and created so many memories growing up, swinging sticks with my brothers in the back garden pretending they were lightsabers. And when Star Wars is ready, and when they have another compelling story to offer me, I'll be delighted to make another journey to a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Well guys, thank you so much for watching such a long video. This took an insanely long amount of time, and this is my first video on this channel in years, so if you're actually a returning subscriber, thank you so much, thank you for sticking around. The last time I made a video here, I was 17 and now I'm 22, so it's kind of crazy. Yeah, this was a very difficult video to make, and I'd like to think the best edited video on my channel, so if you did enjoy it, I would much appreciate it if you could leave a like and subscribe. I can't guarantee there's going to be insanely regular uploads, but I will be doing what I can to make a couple passion projects here and there. With that said, thank you again for watching the video, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one. It might not be another 5 years this time.